What does love look like? That is the sermon topic for this afternoon. It pairs with the lesson that we had this morning at Lakewoods Drive regarding how we are to love one another. This is the final lesson that I prepared in this month that we devoted to the serving life. And the text that we dealt with was in 1 John, middle of chapter 3 through the beginning of chapter 5, about 35 verses or so in which we are required at least 10 different times, depending on how you read, depending on how you define the word required, we are required to love one another. And I've said any number of times in a number of places over the years that if there were any commandment of God that would just stand to reason, that we wouldn't have to be told at all, surely it would be that we're supposed to love one another. What could be more obvious than that? And yet here John is toward the end of a very long life of ministry, a very long life of apostleship, begging his audience, begging us to love one another over and over again. And I put that in the context of the serving life because I found myself having a great deal of difficulty separating the idea of loving your brother and the idea of serving your brother. We serve our brethren because we love them. We know that we love our brethren because we are serving them. They know that we love them because we are serving them. And if we do in fact love, but we are not serving, aren't we hypocrites? Aren't we lying to ourselves? Aren't we lying to the Lord as far as that goes? Go back and read 1 John again to get the point again. I have been really impressed over my life with the degree of compassion, the degree of sharing, of community that is found in some quarters in the Lord's church, but it is not found everywhere. And I urge you, whether you're part of the Lakewoods Drive family or not, to look at your own life and examine yourself carefully, because the text is really quite clear about the importance of this, the centrality of this concept to the gospel message. If Jesus is not touching our hearts enough where we are compelled to love our brethren and to show the love that we have for our brethren by serving them, you wonder how much Jesus has touched our heart at all. If he hasn't gotten us that far, but he has gotten us to the point where we want to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, or we want to worship without the aid of instrumental music, or we want to, whatever the nuance we might want to talk about, is that really the sign of discipleship? If we haven't got to the point where we love our brethren, might I humbly but yet directly suggest we haven't gotten very far at all. And so when we are checking ourselves, I want to administer a bit of a self-test here. What does love actually look like? I'll offer you a few points here, and the lesson will be yours. First of all, I would suggest to you that love has time. If you love something, you make time for it. And I'm not talking about how I really would love to own my own deserted island, or I would love to vacation every year on the south of France, or whatever it happens to be, some large, huge, and perhaps even unattainable dream. That's not the kind of love I'm talking about. Something that is a part of you, something that is accessible, something that connects with you, an experience, a feeling, a memory. I love Italian food, or I love a certain restaurant, or I love my particular football team, or whatever it happens to be. If you have passion in your heart for something, you find a way to make time for it. That's just the most understandable and reasonable thing in the world. Therefore, if we love our brethren, we will make time for our brethren. Now, I would like to think that we would at the very least obey the requirements of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, that says that we're supposed to not be forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the habit of some, not the occasional accident of some, the habit of some. Some people do not care about gathering with the saints. And I think that's probably talking about the Lord's Day assembly more than it is any other thing, but I wouldn't want to limit it to that. In my culture, in my experience, my personal experience, I suspect probably in yours as well, we have any number of opportunities to gather with the saints. Maybe not in worship specifically, perhaps in worship, but in other situations also. To take the Lord's Supper, yes. To sing songs of praise, yes. To instruct one another, to pray together, absolutely. But also simply to bask in one another's company, to be a part of one another's lives. If we do not do that, is that not an indication that we do not have that love? We make the time to go see our favorite movie. We make the time to see our favorite TV show. Do we make time for our brethren? I'm constantly impressed with the attitude that Jesus takes with regard to accidental meetings, as it were. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 13, some children were brought to him that he might lay his hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked them. And the disciples have an attitude about children. It came up in verse number 8 in chapter 18 also. No, we have important things to do. Jesus says this is an important thing. Jesus always has time for children. We read in verse 14, but Jesus said, let the children alone, do not hinder them from coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Perhaps this is Jesus' way of, again, saying what he said back in chapter 18, that there are childlike aspects to your character that you need to be adopting even as adults. But surely at least part of it is he enjoys the company of these little ones. And so he will make time. And it's not like Jesus didn't have anything to do. Jesus had the entire world to die for. And yet he takes a few minutes to reach out to little children and tell them that they are important, that their families are important, their needs are important. How much more so should it be the case for us as the children of God, as those who supposedly are walking in Christ, to make time for other Christians, to make time for other people in general. And as far as that goes, to make time for children. I love spending time around little children. It's a delight to me. I don't have to be forced to do it. I love doing it. And I love spending time with brethren also. We're blessed at Lakewoods Drive to have a crew full of people that you have to basically chase out of the auditorium with a cattle prod after the services are over. Not everybody, of course, but most really enjoy the company of one another. That is a blessing, and it is not seen everywhere. We need to covet that. We need to aspire to that, to grow that in our own hearts, and perhaps by our example, grow it in the hearts of others also. But it starts by taking a little bit of time, and then maybe a little bit more time. Sunday mornings, obviously, is a great opportunity, the best opportunity. But find opportunities beyond that. Maybe not even a face-to-face conversation. You could drop somebody a note. You could write them on Facebook. You could, in some kind of fashion anyway, show that I took a few moments in my day because you are important to me. What does it say about us if we are unwilling to do that? We have 168 hours in the week. Every single one of us has exactly the same amount of time. If you are not saving some of that time for your brethren, I offer to you at least the humble but yet direct suggestion, maybe it's because you don't love your brethren like you should. That is an opportunity for growth there. Point number 2 is that love has an interest, and this explains the time. The reason that we make the time is because we have an interest, because we show an interest. We are engaged in people's lives. What's going on with them is important to us. Again, Jesus is our example, isn't he? Who makes time to see Zacchaeus? Who would do that? Would you do that? Would I do that? This little grubby tax collector, enemy of the people, turncoat, rendering aid to the enemy at the expense of his own people. And yet he wants more than anything on this particular day in Jericho to see Jesus, and Jesus finds him. He seeks him out. He says, I want to know what's going on in your life. I want to be at your house for dinner today. What an amazing example that is for us. Jesus loved us to that degree. Some of us he singled out like he did Zacchaeus, but all of us share a place in his heart. We know that he loves us because he shows us. What greater interest could he show than being willing to die on the cross for our sins, for yours and for mine? That is the example that we are given and the example that we must incorporate into our lives. Philippians chapter 2 and verse number 3 and 4, a text that I go to over and over again. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Do you realize that the people out there in the world, most of them, don't ever do anything that doesn't serve their bottom line? They do what is best for them all the time. They may make isolated exceptions to that, but most of the time, those exceptions, even those, are intended to drive the long-term personal bottom line. Jesus teaches us to be interested, genuinely interested in other people. Not just your own interests, the interests of others. And the reason, of course, is because our behavior is not supposed to be driven by selfishness. And most of our behavior in this world is driven by selfishness. Our world is selfish to the core. We have to work to break that. We are taught every single day by our culture around us to be selfish, to be self-interested. Jesus says, develop an interest in other people. Care about them. Most churches, when they gather, will make some kind of announcements or have them perhaps printed up in written form. These are the people who are sick. These are the people who have requested prayers. Surely the very least that we can offer is to do that. But how difficult is it for me? How difficult is it for you sometimes, maybe, to even mention somebody's name in prayer? Why is that? It's because we're not interested. Because we do not love them enough. And because of that, we cannot even render this simplest and easiest and most impersonal of services. If we cannot manage to mention them in prayer to our God, how can we possibly think that we are serving their interest in any kind of physical or tangible way? Again, it's not difficult for us to generate an interest in things that we genuinely love. How tough is it for you to be convinced to talk about your favorite Marvel character or DC character, if you were into the movies or the comic books? How difficult is it for you to discuss your favorite sporting team, your favorite restaurant, your favorite clothing style, whatever it happens to be, music? Most of us are excited, are very pleased to be drawn into a conversation about the things that we love. In fact, we will invent ways to talk about the things that we love because we have an interest there. When we don't do that with the people of God, that is a telling thing. We need to find a way to genuinely be interested in other people. And thirdly, and this goes along with the other two, love has compassion. It's not just that we are interested. It's not just that we are praying because we're supposed to pray, because the preacher told us, because Hal told us, or whatever. Jesus had genuine compassion for people who were not helping him, many of whom were actually going to kill him in the near future. But he sees them as sheep without a shepherd in Matthew chapter 9 verse 36. His heart goes out to them. He felt compassion for the masses. We could talk about exactly how culpable they were, how easy it should have been for them to get themselves out of this pit that they dragged themselves into, how much they were to be blamed for their callous attitude toward Jesus and to those who came before. We could go on and on and on about that and be completely and totally truthful. That didn't matter to Jesus. Jesus loved them anyway. Jesus cared about them anyway. And so therefore he was motivated to reach out to them. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because it was part of his nature to love them and then to serve them. He did not want to see us in pain. He did not want to see us in sin. It should be natural for us then, if we truly love, for instance, widows and orphans in their affliction, that our heart goes out to them, and not just our hearts, our time, our money, because it touches us in our hearts. This is how we practice pure and undefiled religion, the text says in James chapter 1, verse 27. And I realize that there are other passages that talk about what true religion looks like, what it means to be touched by Jesus, what it means to be controlled by Jesus. That includes other things beyond this. That doesn't mean James 1:27 doesn't say what it says. Those who have been touched by the heart of Christ are going to be compassionate toward those people who are in need, especially those ones who cannot help themselves. Again, not to beat a dead horse about this, but we don't have to be compelled to do this with regard to people, things, situations that we're genuinely in love with. Are we in love with human beings like this? Are we in love with our brethren like this? And let me offer you this before we close up here also. I said that love has time and love has interest and love has compassion. And I'll double down on those points. Absolutely it does. But we could just as easily tweak that and make it a little bit more powerful. Love takes time for brethren. Love takes interest in brethren. Love takes compassion on brethren. If you do not feel this emotional swell in your heart, you find a way to get the emotional swell. You choose to put yourself in a position where you can please God, where you can obey God. Under what circumstance can we beg off of some commandment of Jesus to say, that's not easy for me. I'm not that way. Isn't that the whole point? Isn't the whole point that Jesus sees us in our so-called way, and he's trying to drag us out of that into this other way, this better way, this Christ-like way? If you don't naturally feel compassionate, if you don't naturally feel interested, if you don't naturally reach out with the time that you have for other people, for your brothers and sisters in Christ, do it anyway. I don't especially care for the saying, fake it till you make it, but maybe it applies here. There's an amazing statement given to us in Matthew chapter 6 that we quote in financial situations usually, verses 18, 19, and 20, if I remember right. 19, 20, and 21, sorry. Where Jesus tells us in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in or steal. Now you could say that this spiritual attitude that we're developing here is a treasure and we are placing it in heaven. If only because Jesus is requiring us to do that. I mean, I'd like to think we could come up with better motivation, but let's satisfy ourselves for now with that. I need to love my brethren because I'm going to go to hell if I don't. I need to love my brethren because I have to show the world that Jesus is part of my life. And so I'll do it. I may be dragged kicking and screaming, but I'll do it. I'll find a way to love my brethren. Look at what he says in verse 21. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's an interesting turn of phrase there. It might seem more natural to say where your heart is, there your treasure is also. It's the whole putting all your eggs in one basket and watching that one basket sort of thing. But he says it the other way here. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. It seems almost that Jesus is saying that your behavior can drive your emotion. I would offer to you, and feel free to test me, see if I'm wrong on this. If you will give yourself to service just because you're supposed to, not an emotional thing, not a love kind of thing, simply do the right thing. You are putting treasure in heaven by obeying Jesus Christ. If you will do that consistently, if you will show up every week serving your brethren, putting other people first, showing an interest, forcing an interest in other people, asking questions, listening to answers. If this becomes your life, week after week, month after month, year after year, you may wake up one day and realize that you actually love your brethren. That it actually means something, that you're not just going through the motions anymore. You're doing this because Jesus has almost forced his way into your heart. The gospel has amazing transformative power. We talk about that in other people all the time. Let's open our hearts up to Jesus, our own hearts, and allow him to work this in us so that we can be loving and serving people. Can you imagine being a part of a community where this is the case? Not 75% of the time, not 90% of the time, 100% of the time for 100% of the people. They are consumed with the idea of serving one another. What an amazing experience that would be. Do your part in making sure that it happens in your local fellowship, in your family, among your Christian friends. Be a light to the world and show Jesus by having the kind of love that he had, and show the love by having the kind of service that he had. I hope and pray that you can make this work in your life. And if there's any way at all that I can help, please let me know. Thank you very much. Continue to study. Thank you for being here, and God bless.